wind at Bitter Creek had teeth, and it was looking for a meal. It tore at the thin planks of the station house, screaming through the gaps with a sound like a dying animal. Snow did not fall here so much as it flew sideways, a horizontal blizzard that scoured the land and erased the horizon. It was a place that existed only as a pause, a breath taken by the great iron lung of the railroad before it pushed on into the Montana Territory's unforgiving heart. Into this desolation stepped Annabelle Hawthorne, a ghost in an ivory wedding dress. The dress, her mother's, had been packed with such hope in the warm, humid air of Virginia. Here, the delicate lace at the collar seemed to wither in the cold, and the silk was no match for a wind that had traveled 1,000 miles over frozen earth. She held a single carpet bag, its handle worn smooth, and stood on the empty platform, a solitary figure against the swirling white. The train's whistle faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a weight upon her chest. Every minute that stretched out was another stitch in a tapestry of dread. He was not here. The station master, a man named Henderson with a beard full of ice and eyes the color of a winter sky, had the decency to look uncomfortable. He shuffled his feet, cleared his throat, and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that froze almost before it hit the ground. "He ain't comin'. Miss," he said, the words blunt instruments. "Levi Ransom. He took a wife last month, daughter of some merchant fellow over in Bozeman." Annabelle heard the words, but her mind refused to assemble them into a coherent thought. It was as if he were speaking a foreign language. Married. The word was a stone, dropping into the well of her carefully constructed future and shattering the reflection within. She had spent 4 months exchanging letters with Levi Ransom, letters filled with promises of a sturdy home, a new life, and companionship. His penmanship was neat, his words plain, but she had thought sincere. He had written of the vastness of the sky and the ache of loneliness, an ache she knew well. He had sent the train ticket himself. She did not cry. The shock was too cold for tears. She felt a hollowing out, a sudden, terrifying emptiness where all her hopes had been nested. Her body, of its own accord, moved to a rough wooden bench against the station wall and folded itself down. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, stinging her cheek like a small lash. She did not brush it away. She simply sat, staring out into the white chaos, a bride with no groom, a traveler with no destination. Bitter Creek, Montana Territory. The name felt like a prophecy fulfilled. She was adrift in a sea of bitterness, and the creek was frozen solid. Time lost its meaning. It could have been minutes or an hour that she sat there, the cold seeping through her worn coat and into her very bones, when a new sound cut through the wind's howl. It was the soft crunch of runners on snow and the gentle jingle of a harness. A sleigh, pulled by 2 stout horses that steamed in the frigid air, materialized from the storm. A man sat at the reins, broad-shouldered and still, his face shadowed by the brim of a low-pulled hat. A small bundle of blankets and fur sat beside him. The sleigh pulled to a stop. The man's movements were economical, devoid of any wasted energy as he wrapped the reins. He did not look at her at first. His attention was on the small bundle, which stirred and sat up, revealing itself to be a little girl, no more than 3 years old, with a round face and serious dark eyes. The man swung down from the sleigh, his boots sinking into the snow. He was tall, dressed in a heavy sheepskin coat, and he moved with the quiet competence of a man who spent his life wrestling with the land. When he finally turned his gaze on Annabelle, his expression was unreadable, his face a landscape of quiet grief and exhaustion. He was about to speak, perhaps to ask Henderson about a delivery, but the little girl's voice, small and clear as a winter bell, stopped him. She pointed a mittened hand toward the bench. "Daddy," she whispered, the sound barely snatched from the wind. "She looks like Mommy." The words hung in the air, instantly changing the temperature of the world. They landed on Elijah Carter like a physical blow, a phantom pain from a wound that never truly healed. He froze, his hand halfway to his hat, and stared at the woman on the bench as if seeing her for the first time. He saw the dark hair escaping its pins, the pale oval of her face, the way she held her shoulders with a kind of defeated dignity. It was a fleeting, painful resemblance to his Sarah, enough to make his heart clench in his chest. For Annabelle, the child's words were the first truly human thing she had felt since stepping off the train. They pierced through the fog of her shock and humiliation, a strange and unexpected tether to the world she thought had just abandoned her. She looked at the little girl, whose solemn gaze held no pity, only a simple, profound observation. Elijah recovered himself, the mask of stoicism settling back over his features. He gave Henderson a curt nod, his business forgotten. He knew the look of a person at the end of their rope. He had worn it himself for a long time. His instinct was to retreat, to pull his daughter and his grief back into the isolation of his ranch and let the world handle its own. But Sarah would not have done that. And the girl, Lily, was still staring, her expression unwavering. "There is a storm coming in," Elijah said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question, a bad one. "You cannot stay here." Annabelle found her voice, though it felt rusty from disuse. "I have nowhere to go." The admission was quiet, stripped of all pride. Elijah considered this for a long moment, his gaze sweeping from her to the darkening sky. Every part of him screamed against it, against inviting a complication, a reminder, into his carefully guarded solitude. But leaving her was not an option. He could not leave a dog to the mercy of a night like this, let alone a woman who looked like a broken doll. "My ranch is 5 miles from here," he said, the offer tasting like ash in his mouth. "You can get warm, until you can figure your way." Pride, the last coin in Annabelle's pocket, told her to refuse. She was not a charity case. She was a Hawthorne from Virginia, and her family, though poor, had its dignity. But dignity was a poor blanket against a Montana blizzard. And looking at the child, who was now watching her with an expression of quiet expectation, she felt a pull she could not explain. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The journey to the ranch was a silent passage through a world of white. Annabelle sat beside Elijah, the small form of Lily tucked between them, a warm and living barrier. The cold was relentless, far worse than she could have imagined. She clutched her bag on her lap, her knuckles white. Inside it, tucked into a pocket, was a small linen handkerchief she had embroidered for her trousseau, in neat blue thread. It bore the initials LR, Levi Ransom. The stitches felt like they were burning a hole through the fabric. She began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable tremor. Without a word, Elijah shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was immediate, a solid presence, and it carried the scent of leather, wood smoke, and a faint, clean hint of pine. The gesture was impersonal, a practical act of survival. Yet it felt like the first moment of grace she had known all day. She pulled the collar close, burying her face in its warmth, and for the first time felt the hot prick of tears behind her eyes. She willed them not to fall. The Carter Ranch was not large. It sat in a shallow valley, sheltered by a stand of tall pines that groaned under the weight of the snow. A long, low cabin of dark, sturdy logs formed the main house, with a barn and a few outbuildings standing like silent sentinels nearby. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the oppressive sky, the only sign of life for miles. It was a place of profound isolation, a small fortress of solitude. Inside, a fire roared in a large hearth, casting a warm, flickering light over the main room. The space was tidy, masculine. A rifle rested on pegs over the fireplace, and a set of worn books sat on a simple plank shelf. But there was an absence in the room. the palpable lack of a woman's touch. The curtains were plain, the wooden table unadorned. It was a house, but it did not feel entirely like a home. It felt like a place where someone was waiting. Annabelle stood uncertainly just inside the door, the heavy coat still draped over her shoulders. Lily immediately slipped her small hand into hers, her grip surprisingly strong, and led her toward the fire as if she had lived there her whole life. "You can sit," Elijah said, his voice still distant as he shut the door, sealing them inside against the storm's rising fury. But Annabelle could not sit. To be idle was to be a burden, and she would not be a burden. She shed the heavy coat, folding it carefully and placing it on a chair. She saw a small tear in the cuff of Lily's woolen jacket. Without thinking, she went to her carpet bag, retrieved a small sewing kit, and, in a matter of minutes, had mended the tear with tiny, almost invisible stitches. Elijah watched her, his expression guarded. He saw the competence in her hands, the focused intent in her movements. She was not helpless. She was shipwrecked. There was a difference. Over the next few days, as the blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the small cabin, a quiet rhythm began to establish itself. Annabelle did not wait to be asked. She saw what needed doing and she did it. She helped with the cooking, turning their simple stores of flour, salted meat, and dried beans into savory, filling meals that warmed them from the inside out. She found Elijah's ledger books in a disordered pile and spent an afternoon organizing them with her neat, precise script. She read to Lily from one of the worn books, her soft Virginia accent a strange and gentle music in the rough-hewn cabin. She was earning her keep. It was a matter of survival. But more than that, it was a matter of reclaiming some piece of herself. Levi Ransom had tried to render her worthless. A piece of mail returned to sender, but her worth was not in his acceptance. It was in her own two hands. Elijah remained a quiet, watchful presence. He spoke little of his wife, but Annabelle saw Sarah everywhere. She saw her in the small, faded sampler hanging by the window that read, "Home is where the heart is." She saw her in the way Lily would sometimes stop and look at her with that same searching, heartbreaking hope. And she saw her most of all in the deep, unhealed sorrow in Elijah's eyes. He was a man who had bricked up the doorway to his own heart, and he was living in the cold rooms left behind. He was polite, he was fair, but he was distant, a man living on an island of his own making. Annabelle understood. She was on an island of her own, too. Sometimes, in conversation about supplies or the ranch, he would mention Silas Crow, a name that seemed to leave a bad taste in his mouth. He spoke of Crow buying up land, controlling water rights, and having the railroad in his pocket. It was just talk, distant thunder, but it added to the sense of a harsh, competitive world just beyond the shelter of the valley. The heart of the house was Lily. The child had attached herself to Annabelle with a fierce and primal instinct. She followed her from room to room, a small shadow. She brought her treasures, a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, a crudely carved wooden horse. She would crawl into Annabelle's lap when she sat by the fire, her small body radiating a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. She was the emotional compass of their small, stranded party, pointing always toward a need so fundamental it could not be ignored. One evening, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white under a ceiling of brilliant stars. The cabin was quiet. Lily had fallen asleep in Annabelle's lap as she mended one of Elijah's shirts, her breathing soft and even. Annabelle looked down at the child's peaceful face, a fierce wave of protectiveness washing over her. Elijah sat across the hearth, cleaning his rifle, the firelight catching the planes of his face. He had been watching them, a strange conflict playing out in his eyes. "You can stay," he said, the words dropping into the silence, "until the thaw. until the roads are clear and you can decide what is next for you. Annabelle looked up, her needle poised in midair. She looked from his serious face down to the sleeping child in her arms. Leaving would mean returning to the void. It would mean facing a world that saw her as a fool or an object of pity. Here, in this strange, quiet house with this broken man and his motherless child, she was, at least for a little while, needed. It was not the life she had chosen, but it was a life. It was a shelter. Kindness, not passion, had opened a door, and for now, she was grateful to step through it. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "I will." The thaw came not as a rush of water, but as a slow, grudging retreat of the cold. The world outside the cabin remained a landscape of white and gray, but the iron grip of the blizzard had been broken. Inside the Carter house, a different kind of thaw was taking place, one just as quiet and tentative. Annabelle was no longer a piece of flotsam washed ashore by a storm. She had become part of the current of the house itself. Her days took on a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. She rose before the sun, the first to coax the embers in the hearth back to life. The smell of coffee and frying bacon soon filled the cabin, a simple comfort that chipped away at the cold morning silence. She discovered a neglected sourdough starter in the pantry and resurrected it. And soon the house was filled with the honest, wholesome scent of baking bread. Elijah's ledger, once a chaotic jumble of receipts and scrawled notes, was now a model of order. Annabelle would sit at the table in the evenings, a lamp casting a golden circle of light, her pen scratching softly as she balanced accounts and tracked expenses. She had a mind for numbers, a practicality that Elijah, who thought in seasons and cattle, found both foreign and quietly impressive. His gratitude was a silent thing, a weight he carried with a kind of defensive stoicism. He would find his favorite shirt, one he thought was frayed beyond repair, laid out on his bed with a patch so neat it was a work of art. He would come in from the cold to find a hot cup of tea waiting for him, without a word being exchanged. He was thankful, but the gratitude was tangled with a deep, abiding unease. The house was changing. The sharp edges of his grief were being softened by her presence. The home was becoming a home again, and that felt like a betrayal. He would watch her sometimes as she sat by the fire with Lily, teaching the girl her letters from one of the worn books. He would see the firelight catch the curve of her cheek, hear the soft cadence of her voice, and a ghost would rise in his heart. Sarah had sat in that same chair. Sarah had read from that same book. He would feel a door closing inside him and would turn away, retreating to the barn, to the familiar, uncomplicated world of his livestock and his work. Lily, however, had no such reservations. To her, Annabelle was not a complication or a memory. She was a fact, a warm and constant sun that had risen in her small world. She was the one who could braid hair just right, who knew stories about talking animals in a place called Virginia, and who never tired of answering a child's endless stream of questions. A few weeks after the great storm, the trails became passable enough for visitors. The first to arrive was Samuel, the old ranch hand who had worked for Elijah's father. He was a man made of leather and gristle, with eyes that had seen 70 winters come and go. He stomped the snow from his boots on the porch and entered, his gaze taking in the scene, the neat room, the smell of stew, Annabelle humming softly as she stirred a pot. He accepted a cup of coffee and sat by the fire, talking to Elijah about a sick calf and the state of the fences on the North Range. But his eyes kept drifting to Annabelle and Lily. When he left, he paused by the door and spoke to Elijah in a low voice. "That one," he said, nodding toward Annabelle. "She has good hands and a quiet spirit. The girl needs that." He said nothing more, but the words were a seed planted in the hard soil of Elijah's mind. Their next visitor was Reverend Calhoun, a tall, severe man whose piety seemed to suck the warmth from any room he entered. He came to check on his flock, his gaze sweeping over the domestic scene with a judgmental air. His questions were pointed. How long was Miss Hawthorne planning to stay? What would folks in town think of such an arrangement? Annabel answered him with a calm, unshakable dignity, explaining her circumstances without apology. But his visit left a chill in the air, a reminder that their small, self-contained world was subject to the harsh opinions of the one beyond. It was Ruthie, a neighboring rancher's widow who sometimes came to help with larger chores, who brought a gust of uncomplicated warmth. She was a round, bustling woman with a ready laugh. She took one look at Annabel's organized pantry and declared her a miracle worker. She sat with her at the table, shelling peas and trading stories, her cheerful gossip a welcome antidote to the Reverend's dour pronouncements. She spoke of Levi Ransom with contempt, calling him a coward with a weak chin, and assured Annabel she was far better off. Her easy acceptance was a balm. But as winter tightened its hold once more, a far more dangerous visitor arrived, one that no door could keep out. It started with the men in the bunkhouse, a racking cough and a fever that left them weak and shivering. Then it crept into the main cabin. It found Lily first. One afternoon, her cheeks were too flushed, her eyes too bright. By nightfall, she was burning with fever, her small body trembling under the quilts. A raw, panicked fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Elijah's carefully constructed walls. He remembered standing helpless as a similar fever had consumed Sarah 2 years before. The town doctor was miles away, and a fresh fall of snow had made the roads treacherous, likely impossible. They were alone. Annabel, however, was not one to be paralyzed by fear. She became a general commanding a tiny army against an invisible enemy. She sent Elijah to fetch snow to keep the room cool. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark, something her grandmother had taught her. She bathed Lily's forehead with cool cloths, her hands steady, her movements efficient and filled with a desperate tenderness. For 2 days and 2 nights, she did not sleep. She sat by the child's bedside, a constant, watchful presence. Elijah would stand in the doorway, a helpless giant, the fear of loss, a physical sickness in his own stomach. He saw not a stranger, but a woman fighting for his daughter's life with a ferocity he had not known she possessed. On the 3rd night, the fever was at its peak. Lily was delirious, muttering fragments of words, her breathing shallow and ragged. The cabin was silent save for the crackling fire and the child's labored breaths. Annabel was exhausted, her own body aching with fatigue, but she held Lily's small, hot hand in her own, a lifeline in the dark. Almost unconsciously, she began to hum, a low, soothing melody. Then her voice, soft and a little shaky from weariness, began to form words. She sang an old song, a tune of rivers and farewells, a song of longing for a place called home. She sang of the Shenandoah. Elijah was standing just outside the bedroom, in the shadows of the main room. The first few notes of the song stopped his heart. It was Sarah's song. It was the lullaby she had sung to Lily every night of her short life. He leaned against the doorframe, the wood cold against his back, and the sound washed over him. It was not a ghost's voice. It was Annabel's, filled with its own unique sorrow and strength. He was hearing the song not as an echo of what he had lost, but as a prayer for what he was terrified to lose again. In that moment, watching this woman he barely knew sing his dead wife's song to his dying daughter, the last of the ice around his heart finally, painfully, broke. He saw her, not as a replacement, not as a reminder, but as Annabel, a woman of substance and grace, stranded by fate in his home, now fighting to keep the very center of his world from collapsing. He did not speak, he simply kept his vigil. He brought her water, which she drank without looking away from the child. He kept the fire fed, ensuring the chill of the house never reached the sick room. He was a silent partner in her tireless work, his presence a steady anchor in the terrifying night. They were two people bound together by a single, desperate hope. Toward dawn, something shifted. Lily's breathing deepened, becoming more regular. The frantic trembling in her limbs ceased. Annabel laid a hand on her forehead. The ferocious heat had lessened. She slumped in her chair, a wave of relief so profound it felt like a physical blow washing over her. She watched as Lily's eyelids fluttered open. The delirium was gone. Her eyes were clear. "Annie," the child whispered, her voice weak but her own. Tears Annabel had refused to shed for her own misfortune now streamed down her face. They were tears of exhaustion and overwhelming relief. Elijah had stepped into the room, drawn by the change in the silence. He saw the tears on her face, saw his daughter looking at him with recognition, and a breath he did not realize he had been holding for 3 days escaped his lungs in a ragged sigh. He walked to the bed and laid his large, calloused hand on Lily's head, his touch impossibly gentle. His eyes met Annabel's over the sleeping child. No words were needed. No promises were made. No oaths sworn. But in that quiet, dawn-lit room, something had been forged. A family had taken shape, not by law or by blood, but by the shared crucible of fear and the simple, sacred act of caring. It was a bond made of sleepless nights and spoonfuls of broth, a trust built in the silent hours of a long and desperate watch. The house was quiet now, but it was a new quiet, one filled not with absence, but with the weary, peaceful weight of a battle won together. With Lily's recovery, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. It was a peace born of shared relief, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the long, fevered nights. The dynamic in the small cabin had irrevocably shifted. Annabel was no longer a guest, and Elijah was no longer just a benefactor. They were partners in the simple, demanding enterprise of keeping a home and a child safe. As the days grew longer and the sun gained a timid strength, the snow began to recede from the valley floor, revealing the pale, sleeping earth beneath. It was a time of transition, and it stirred in Annabel a need to confront the last remnants of the life she had left behind in Virginia. In the small room that had become hers, there was a second trunk, one she had not touched since her arrival. It held the finer things she had brought for her married life, a life that had proven to be a fiction. For weeks, she had been unable to look at it. Now, she felt a quiet compulsion to put it in order, to deal with the ghosts packed inside. She lifted the lid. The scent of lavender and cedar, a scent of home, rose to meet her. Here were her good dresses, a set of silver-backed brushes from her grandmother, and a small collection of books. Tucked in a side pocket, beneath a stack of neatly folded linens, was a small bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Levi's letters. She had not had the heart to burn them, and beneath them, a single, sealed envelope that had arrived just before she left, one she had read quickly and packed away in the flurry of her departure. She had remembered its contents as hurried and brief. Now, she pulled it out and read it again in the clear, unforgiving light of a Montana morning. It was not a love letter. It was a coward's hedge. "Annabel," it read, "I trust your journey is arranged. There have been some changes here. Things are not as I wrote. It is too complicated for a letter. We will speak of it when you arrive. I will be at the station. Levi." Every word was a small, sharp betrayal. He had known he was not going to meet her as a groom. He had let her travel 2,000 miles, into a land she did not know, to a station in the middle of a blizzard, knowing he would not be there for her. He had not even had the courage to tell her not to come. He had simply set the stage for her humiliation, leaving the final, cruel revelation to a stranger. A cold, clean anger, unlike any she had ever known, washed through her. It was not the hot, fleeting anger of a moment, but a deep, structural rage that settled in her bones. It burned away the last vestiges of her shame, leaving behind a hard, clear resolve. That evening, after Lily was asleep, a profound quiet settled over the main room. Elijah was mending a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and all. Annabel sat across from him, the offending letter in her hands. The silence between them was no longer the cautious space of strangers. It was a comfortable quiet, one that could hold the weight of difficult things. "He knew," she said, her voice low but steady. She held the letter out to him. "He knew before I ever stepped on the train." Elijah stopped his work. He took the letter and read it, his expression hardening. He folded it carefully and handed it back to her. "I was a fool," she said, the words tasting like poison. "I wanted to believe in a new start so badly that I did not see the man writing the words. I saw only the words themselves." Elijah set aside his work and looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "The foolishness was his, not yours," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He is the one who saw a good and decent woman and saw fit to treat her like a piece of cargo he had no use for. That is his failing. It says nothing about you, Annabel. Nothing at all." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "When Sarah died," he began, and the name hung in the air between them, not as a ghost but as a quiet truth. "Something in this house went silent. Something in me went silent. I am grateful for what you have done, for Lily, for this home. But I need you to know, my heart has been silent for a long time. I do not know if it will ever speak again." The confession was an act of profound respect. He was not offering her a future or a romance. He was offering her the unvarnished truth of his own brokenness. He was telling her that while he could see her worth, he was not whole enough to meet it. Annabel felt a strange sense of relief. She was not looking for a replacement for Levi Ransom. She was looking for a replacement for the dignity he had tried to steal from her. And here, in this quiet cabin, from this quiet, grieving man, she had found it. "I am not asking for it to speak, Elijah," she said softly. "I am just grateful for a place to be silent, too." The new understanding between them solidified in the weeks that followed. The thaw continued, and with it came the need to prepare for spring. One afternoon, Elijah hitched the sleigh for a trip to Bitter Creek to fetch supplies. It was Annabel's first time away from the ranch since the day she had arrived. The town, if it could be called that, was little more than the station, a general store, a saloon, and a handful of houses, as Elijah loaded sacks of flour and salt into the sleigh. Annabel went into the store. The proprietor, a man with a perpetually worried expression, was talking with Deputy Harlan, a young lawman with honest eyes. She did not mean to eavesdrop, but she heard her own name, and then Levi Ransom's. The storekeeper was gossiping. He spoke of how Levi had lost a great deal of money in a bad cattle speculation, how he was deep in debt to Silas Crow. "Crow owns him now, body and soul," the storekeeper said, lowering his voice. "I hear Crow has been asking questions about the Carter place, about the water." Deputy Harlan shot a glance toward the door, saw Annabel, and had the decency to look embarrassed. "That is enough talk. Henry," he said, his voice firm. He tipped his hat to Annabel. "Ma'am." On the ride back to the ranch, Annabel was quiet. She watched the landscape, now a patchwork of melting snow and dark, wet earth. She was thinking about the creek that ran through the Carter Valley. It was the ranch's lifeblood, fed by the mountain's snowmelt. It was the only reliable source of water for miles, irrigating the hayfields in the summer and watering the cattle year-round. Without it, the ranch would wither and die. "Elijah," she said, finally breaking the silence. "The man in the store, he said Silas Crow was asking about your water." Elijah's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Crow has been wanting this valley since my father's time. He owns the land to the north and the south. I am the only thing standing in his way of controlling the entire pass." "And Levi Ransom, she said the name tasting foul. The man said he is in debt to Crow." Elijah pulled the horses to a stop. He turned on the seat to face her. "Levi worked for me for a season a few years back. He said, his voice grim. "He knows this land. He knows where the springs are. He knows the boundaries of the grazing rights. He knows everything Crow would need to know to make a legal challenge, or an illegal one." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Levi, desperate and weak, was a tool waiting to be used by a man like Crow. The threat was no longer an abstract rumor. It was a clear and present danger. And it was aimed directly at the heart of this place, at the man and the child who had taken her in. Her own personal grievance with Levi now felt small in comparison. This was about survival. Her plans had been to leave when the spring roads were fully open. She would find work as a seamstress or a bookkeeper in Bozeman, or maybe even travel further west. But as they rode back into the quiet valley, as the log cabin came into view with its plume of welcoming smoke, she knew she could not go. Not yet. To leave now would feel like its own kind of abandonment. That night, she found Elijah studying a map of the property spread out on the table. The lines of the creek were drawn in a deep, dark blue. It looked like a vein carrying life through the land. "The calving will begin soon," she said, standing beside him. "You will need help with the tally, and with the books." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "I would like to stay," she continued, her voice steady. "Through the spring, to help, if you will have me." A long moment passed. He looked from her face to the map, to the blue line that represented everything he was fighting for. "I would," he said, his voice quiet. Her decision was made. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a participant. She had a stake in the fight for this small piece of the world. A few days later, as she was walking near the edge of the property, her gaze was drawn to the low hills that bordered the valley to the north. On Crow's land. A rider sat on a horse, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. He was too far away to make out any features, but he was watching the ranch. He sat there for a long time, a silent, motionless predator, before turning his horse and melting back into the landscape. A shiver ran down Annabelle's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The thaw had come, but the danger was just beginning. The first shoots of green were pushing their way through the dark, damp soil of the vegetable garden. Annabelle knelt, her hands in the earth, a feeling of profound satisfaction warming her. This was real. The soil was real. The promise of food she would grow herself was real. After a lifetime of genteel poverty in Virginia, where her hands were expected to be soft and her accomplishments ornamental, this simple, honest work felt like a prayer. She was planting roots, both for the garden and for herself. A shadow fell over her. She did not look up at first, assuming it was Elijah or perhaps Samuel come from the barn. "You always did have a way with growing things." The voice was a specter from a buried life. It was thinner than she remembered, with a nervous, wheedling edge. Annabelle froze, her fingers clutching a clump of soil. She looked up slowly, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Levi Ransom stood at the edge of the garden. He looked diminished, worn down by the winter and by something else, a kind of internal decay. His clothes were not those of a prosperous merchant's son-in-law. They were frayed at the cuffs, and his boots were scuffed and muddy. His eyes darted around, never quite meeting hers. "What are you doing here?" "Levi." Her voice was flat, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside her. "I came to make things right. Annabelle, I came to apologize." He took a step closer, his hands held out in a gesture of supplication. "I was a fool, a coward. I should have told you everything. My finances. Things were a mess. I made a bad choice. I have regretted it every single day." Annabelle rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her hands onto her apron. She looked at this man who had nearly been her husband, who had authored her deepest humiliation, and she felt nothing but a distant, cold contempt. "Your regrets are of no interest to me." "Please," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more urgent. He took another step, his eyes now scanning the path toward the house. You have to listen. This is a hard country for a woman on her own. You have landed on your feet here. I can see that. Carter is a decent man, but people talk. Stories get started. The apology was evaporating, revealing the threat beneath. What kind of stories, she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Just stories, he said with a weak shrug. About a mail-order bride who arrived for a wedding that never happened. A woman living alone with a widower. People have narrow minds. Annabelle, your good name. It is a fragile thing out here. He paused, letting the poison sink in. Silas Crow. He has an interest in this valley. He wants to buy this ranch. He thinks Carter might sell for the right price or with the right encouragement. Crow is a man who pays for information. He pays for leverage. What are you saying? I am saying, Levi whispered, his eyes finally locking with hers, that a story about Carter's unfortunate guest could make him eager to avoid a scandal. It might make him more reasonable. On the other hand, if Crow were to hear that the situation here is stable, that Carter has a respectable woman helping to raise his child, well, that changes things. See, my word still has value here. I can make things very difficult for you, or I can make them easy. He reached out and touched her arm. The contact was odious, a violation. Annabelle stood frozen, trapped between the man who had abandoned her and the man who was now trying to use her as a pawn. The entire ugly transaction was laid bare, her reputation, her safety. All of it was a commodity to be traded for his own wretched survival. It was at that moment that Elijah came around the corner of the cabin. He stopped dead, taking in the scene Levi, his hand on Annabelle's arm, his face intense and pleading, Annabelle pale and motionless. He could not hear the words, only the low, urgent tone. He saw a former suitor, a rival, speaking intimately with the woman who had brought his house back to life. And in that instant, his own carefully guarded heart betrayed him. The fear of being made a fool of, the deep wound of his wife's loss, the raw insecurity of a man who had forgotten how to love. All of it rose up in a cold, bitter tide. He saw a choice being made, and he assumed it was not in his favor. I see you have matters to discuss. Elijah's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as ice. I will leave you to them. He did not wait for an answer. He turned on his heel and walked toward the barn, his back rigid, a wall of judgment. Levi's hand dropped from her arm as if it had been burned. A flicker of triumph crossed his face. He had planted his seeds of discord. You think about what I said. Annabelle, he murmured, and then he was gone, melting back toward the hills like the coward he was. Annabelle stood alone in the garden, the green shoots at her feet suddenly looking fragile and doomed. The coldness in Elijah's voice had hurt her more than Levi's threats. Levi was a known quantity, a man of weak character, but Elijah, she had come to believe he saw her. He saw her worth, and now, at the first sign of trouble, he had judged her and found her wanting. He had not given her a chance to speak, had not asked a single question. He had simply closed the door. She did not follow him to the barn. Her pride, the same pride that had seen her through the desolation of her arrival, would not allow it. If he could believe for 1 second that she would entertain the pathetic pleas of a man like Levi Ransom, then there was nothing left to say. The rest of the day passed in a strained, suffocating silence. Elijah did not come in for the midday meal. When he finally returned to the house that evening, he was remote, his face a mask of stone. He spoke only to Lily. He did not look at Annabelle. He ate the supper she had prepared without a word of thanks. The quiet, comfortable space they had built together had been demolished. They were two strangers again, sharing a roof. That night, Annabelle could not sleep. She lay in her bed, staring into the darkness, and understood a terrible truth. She was a guest here. She had mistaken kindness for permanence. She was a complication in this man's life, and now a source of suspicion. She could not stay where she was not trusted. Before the first light of dawn, she rose and began to pack. Her movements were quiet, deliberate. She folded the dresses she had worn to cook and clean and care for a child. She packed her books. She looked around the small, neat room that had been her sanctuary. She was leaving it better than she had found it. It was the only comfort she could take with her. She found the small linen handkerchief with the embroidered allure and, without a moment's hesitation, tossed it into the cold ashes of the hearth. As she worked, a small sound made her turn. Lily stood in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper, her eyes wide with sleep and a dawning fear. "Are you going away?" "Annie," she whispered. Annabelle's heart broke. She knelt and gathered the child in her arms, burying her face in her soft hair. "I have to, sweet girl," she murmured, her voice thick. "But I will never, ever forget you." She tucked Lily back into her bed, her small face now crumpled in a silent cry. As Annabelle turned to leave the room, she saw the piece of paper had fallen to the floor. She picked it up. It was one of Lily's drawings. 3 stick figures stood under a bright yellow sun, a tall one, a smaller one, and one in a dress. They were all holding hands. Beneath the drawing, in the clumsy, earnest scrawl of a child just learning her letters, were 5 words. "Please stay. I want you." Then she saw a word had been crossed out, and a new one put in its place. "Please stay. I want you to be my mommy." A sob escaped Annabelle's throat. She clutched the paper to her chest. It was a plea from the only person in this house who saw the truth with perfect, uncomplicated clarity. But it did not change anything. She could not be a mother to a child whose father looked at her with suspicion in his eyes. She quietly placed the drawing on the pillow next to Lily's sleeping head. With her single bag packed, the same one she had arrived with, she slipped out of the house. The air was cold and clean, the sky to the east just beginning to pale. The long walk to the station at Bitter Creek had begun. She did not look back. Inside the cabin, Elijah had been awake for hours, sitting in the dark, his pride a cold and lonely companion. The silence of the house was wrong. It was the old silence, the empty silence that had descended after Sarah's death. He had not realized how much he had come to hate it until it returned. A noise from Lily's room, a soft whimper, finally propelled him to his feet. He pushed her door open. She was awake, tears streaming down her face, clutching her pillow. Annie is gone. She wept. His first thought was a flare of bitter confirmation. She had left. She had gone to meet ransom. Then his eyes fell on the crumpled drawing on the floor beside her bed where it had fallen again. He picked it up. He saw the 3 figures, the man, the woman, the child, a family. He saw the childish scrawl, the plea, the heartbreaking correction. "I want you to be my mommy." The cold structure of his pride and suspicion shattered into 1,000 pieces. He had been a blind fool. While he was nursing his own wounded ego, this good, kind woman was being threatened, and his child was holding on to her as the only mother she had ever truly known. He had seen a betrayal where there was only a desperate plea for help. He had pushed away the best thing that had happened to his family since the light had gone out 2 years ago. He stood there, the child's drawing trembling in his hand, and looked out the window. The sun was just beginning to crest the mountains, flooding the valley with a cold, clear light, and on the long, empty trail leading out of the valley, he could just make out a small, solitary figure, walking away. The world was a smear of gray and white, and Elijah Carter rode into it like a man possessed. He did not saddle his best horse. He threw a blanket and bridle on the nearest one, a powerful roan, and launched himself onto its back. Lily's drawing was tucked inside his coat, a fragile piece of paper that felt like it was burning a hole straight through to his heart. Each beat of the horse's hooves on the snow-packed trail was a hammer blow against his own stupidity. Fool, blind, proud fool. He had built walls around his heart so high and thick he had thought them impenetrable, a fortress to keep the pain of loss from ever entering again. But he had not realized they also served as a prison, keeping him locked inside with his own ghosts. Annabelle had not tried to tear those walls down. She had simply planted a garden at their base, quietly tending to the soil, bringing life to a place he had abandoned. She had filled his silent house with the scent of baking bread and the sound of his daughter's laughter. And when he had seen her with Levi Ransom, he had not seen a woman being threatened. He had seen a threat to his own miserable solitude. He had chosen the familiar pain of loneliness over the terrifying vulnerability of hope. A sudden squall of spring snow began to fly, thick wet flakes that clung to his eyelashes and melted on his face like cold tears. He urged the horse faster, his body low against its neck, the wind tearing at him. He remembered the look on her face when he had spoken to her with such cold dismissal, the flicker of shock, then the quiet shuddering of her spirit as she retreated behind her own wall of dignity. He had taken her strength and called it betrayal. He had taken her grace and called it a lie. The 5 miles to Bitter Creek felt like 100. With every stride of the horse, the image of Annabelle walking away, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape, grew sharper in his mind. He was not just chasing a woman he had wronged. He was chasing the future he had been too cowardly to imagine, a future where his house was a home again, where his daughter had a mother's love, where his own silent heart might, just might, learn to speak again. He saw the station ahead, a dark shape against the swirling snow, the thin trickle of smoke from its chimney a fragile sign of life. A single horse and buggy were tied to the hitching post. He prayed he was not too late, that the eastbound train had not yet come and gone. Taking her with it, he swung down from the roan before it had even stopped, its sides heaving, and burst through the station door. The waiting room was nearly empty. Henderson, the station master, looked up from his paperwork, his expression one of mild surprise, and there she was. She stood by the window, her back to the room, her single bag at her feet. She was staring out at the tracks, a figure of profound and lonely stillness. She had not bought a ticket yet. She was simply waiting. "Annabelle." His voice was a raw sound, torn from his throat by the wind and his own desperation. She turned, her face pale, her eyes showing no surprise, only a deep, weary sadness. "Do not go," he said, taking a step toward her. He stopped, not wanting to crowd her, to presume he had any right to be in her space. "There is nothing for me here. Elijah," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I will not stay where I am a source of suspicion." It was not suspicion, he said, the words a confession. It was fear and pride. "I was a fool. I saw that man, and I did not think of you. I thought only of myself, of being hurt again. I let my own ghosts speak for me. And they are liars." He reached into the pocket of his coat. His fingers closed around a small, smooth object. It was a simple gold band, worn thin with time. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice unsteady. He walked toward her and held it out in his calloused palm. "She gave it to me for Sarah." Annabelle looked at the ring, then back at his face. Her expression did not change. "I am not offering you what I offered her," he continued, the truth of it costing him everything. "I do not have a whole heart to give you, Annabelle. It is a broken, silent thing. But I am asking if you would be willing to teach it how to speak again. I am not asking you to stay for Lily, and I am not asking you to stay to be my cook or my bookkeeper. I am asking you to stay for me, because I see you. I see your strength and your goodness and your grace, and I have been a blind fool for not seeing it sooner. I need you to stay." It was the most honest, most painful, most beautiful proposal a woman had ever received. He was not promising her a perfect life or a perfect love. He was offering her the broken, authentic truth of himself and asking her to build something new with him from the ruins. She looked from the ring in his hand to the raw vulnerability in his eyes. She thought of the life that awaited her somewhere down the tracks, a life of lonely independence, of always being a stranger. Then she thought of the small log cabin in the valley, of a little girl's drawing, of the feeling of her hands in the soil of her own garden. This was not about being rescued. This was about choosing a life, a hard, uncertain, beautiful life. She was choosing it for herself. "The train ticket," she said softly to Henderson, who was watching them with undisguised interest. "I will not be needing it." She looked back at Elijah and reached out, not for the ring, but to lay her hand gently on his arm. It was an acceptance, a beginning. The ride back to the ranch was a long, quiet passage. The snow squall had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and bright under the morning sun. Annabelle sat beside him in the buggy he had hired, his mother's ring now warm on her finger. It was too large, but it was a comfortable weight. They did not speak of love or make grand promises. They spoke of the spring planting, of the price of feed, of the new calves that would be born soon. They spoke of the foundations of a life, laying one practical brick at a time. When they arrived, Lily was on the porch, a small, forlorn sentinel. When she saw Annabelle step down from the buggy, a cry of pure, unadulterated joy escaped her, and she ran and threw herself into Annabelle's arms, burying her face in her skirts. "You came back," she sobbed. "You came back." Annabelle held her tight, her own eyes filling with tears. "I came home," she whispered. Over the top of the child's head, her eyes met Elijah's, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it reached his eyes, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The joy that settled over the ranch in the following days was a quiet, tentative thing. It was a fragile bloom, and they all seemed to instinctively know that it needed to be nurtured carefully. But the world outside their valley had not gone away. Their enemy had not forgotten them. A week later, one of Silas Crow's foremen rode into their yard. He was a hard man with cold eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. He did not dismount. He delivered his message from the saddle, a king's emissary speaking to peasants. "Mr. Crow is prepared to make you a final offer." "Carter," he said, his gaze sweeping over the ranch with contempt. "He will purchase the water rights to the creek, all of them, for a fair price." "The water is not for sale," Elijah said, his voice level, Annabelle and Lily standing just behind him in the doorway. The foreman's mouth twisted into a semblance of a smile. "Crow figured you would say that. He said to tell you the summers are getting drier. A man's cattle can get lost. They can wander into bad territory. Fences can break. Accidents happen. It would be a shame to lose your herd because you were too stubborn to see a good deal when it was on the table." He spat on the ground, a brown stain against the clean earth. "You have until the 1st of June to reconsider." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving a trail of menace in the clean spring air. The threat hung over them, a dark cloud on the horizon. That night, the mood in the cabin was somber. They were no longer just fighting for a future together. They were fighting for their very survival. "He means to choke us out," Elijah said, staring into the fire. "Without the water, the hayfields will burn up by July. I would have to sell the herd for pennies on the dollar. The ranch would be worthless." Annabelle came and stood beside him. During her time organizing his books, she had come to understand the economics of the ranch as well as he did. She knew their margins were thin, their savings almost non-existent. A single bad season could ruin them. "Then we cannot let him have the water," she said, her voice filled with a steely resolve he was coming to know well. She went to the table and unrolled the map of the property. "Look," she said, her finger tracing a line. "This upper meadow, here, it is boggy in the spring. There is another source of water there, a smaller one. What if we dug a secondary irrigation ditch, one that fed directly into the main pasture, bypassing the lower hayfields? It would be a tremendous amount of work. But if we could do it, we would not be wholly dependent on the main creek." She then went to the ledger book, "And we will document everything." she said, her pen tapping the page. "Every hour of labor, every dollar spent on tools. We will create a record of our improvements, of our self-sufficiency. If Crow tries to make a legal claim, we will have proof that we are not just surviving, but improving this land. It will make his case that much weaker." Elijah looked at her, a sense of awe dawning on his face. He saw in acres and cattle. She saw in numbers and strategy. Together, they were formidable. A flicker of hope, the first he had felt since the foreman's visit, ignited within him. The next day, their neighbor Ruthie stopped by, her face etched with worry. She sat at their table, her usual cheerfulness absent. "Be careful." "Elijah," she said, her voice a low whisper. "I was in town yesterday. There is a man asking questions, a stranger. I have seen his kind before. He has the look of a man who hires out his gun." She wrung her hands. "They say he is on Crow's payroll. And last night, my boy saw him, up on the ridge overlooking your north pasture, just sitting there, watching." The work was brutal, relentless, and Annabelle had never felt more alive. Calving season descended upon the valley not as a gentle miracle, but as a tide of mud, blood, and exhaustion. The world shrank to the size of the birthing pens and the vast, open range. She learned to ride until her muscles screamed, her hands raw from the reins. Old Samuel, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, became her unlikely tutor. He taught her how to swing a rope, how to spot a calf in distress, and how to pull a newborn from its mother with a firm, steady hand. He never offered praise, but she would sometimes catch him watching her, a look of grudging respect in his faded blue eyes. Elijah saw it all. He saw her come in long after dark, covered in mud, her hair escaping its pins, too tired to eat. He saw her hands, no longer the soft hands of a Virginia lady, but chapped, calloused, and capable. He watched her one afternoon during a sudden, violent dust storm that turned the sky a sickly yellow. While the other hands fought to get the herd into the shelter of the valley, a young calf got separated from its mother before he could shout a warning. Annabelle had urged her horse into the swirling dust, her face set with determination, and expertly guided the panicked animal back to the herd. A quiet, fierce pride swelled in his chest. This was not the fragile woman from the train station. This was a woman made of iron and grace. The threat from Silas Crow felt both distant and ever-present. The sight of a lone rider on a faraway ridge would send a chill through the warm spring air. Wolves, bolder than usual, began to harass the edges of the herd, their howls a nightly chorus that frayed the nerves. It felt as if the entire world, man and nature, was testing them, trying to find a weakness. Ruthie brought a welcome dose of sanity. She would ride over with a basket of fresh eggs and a barrage of cheerful gossip, her laughter a tonic against the siege mentality that had begun to grip the ranch. Heard Silas Crow lost 100 head of cattle to a rock slide up north, she announced one afternoon with great satisfaction. Serves the greedy old buzzard right. The Lord might not always be swift, but he certainly has a sense of humor. Her visits were a reminder that there was a world beyond their struggle, a world of decent, hard-working people who wished them well. The breaking point came on a moonless, suffocatingly still night. Annabelle was woken by a frantic shouting, then the terrifying, unmistakable roar of a fire. She threw on her clothes and ran outside. The world was bathed in a hellish orange light. The main hay barn, filled to the rafters with the winter feed that was the herd's lifeline, was a raging inferno. Flames licked at the sky, sending a shower of glowing embers onto the dry grass. Elijah was already there, shouting orders, his face a grim mask of fury in the firelight. He and Samuel were trying to get the horses out of the adjacent stable before the fire could spread. Men from the bunkhouse were forming a bucket brigade from the creek, a desperate, futile effort against the sheer scale of the blaze. Annabelle did not hesitate. She grabbed a bucket and took her place in the line. Her movements automatic. The heat was a physical blow. searing her skin. The air was thick with smoke that clawed at her throat and made her eyes stream. She passed bucket after bucket of water, her arms aching, her mind a blank slate of pure, focused effort. She was no longer a woman, no longer Annabelle Hawthorne. She was a part of a single organism fighting for its life. She saw Elijah emerge from the stable, leading the last of the terrified horses, his shirt smoking from a stray ember. Their eyes met for a split second across the fiery chaos, a moment of shared, desperate understanding. They were in this together. It was a losing battle. The barn was a total loss, its frame collapsing in on itself in a final, spectacular shower of sparks. Their fight shifted to containment, dousing the surrounding structures, beating back the grass fires with wet sacks. They worked like demons until the danger of it spreading had passed, and the inferno had dwindled to a smoldering, black skeleton against the first gray light of dawn. As if on cue, the sky opened up. A cold, hard rain began to fall, hissing on the hot embers, turning the soot-covered ground into a black slurry. The bucket brigade dissolved, the men slumping back to the bunkhouse, their shoulders bowed in defeat. The winter hay was gone. Ruin stared them in the face. Annabelle and Elijah stood alone, two soot-stained figures in the downpour, watching the rain finish their work. They were beyond exhaustion, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and fatigue. Without a word, Elijah took her arm and led her to the shelter of the cabin's long front porch. They sank onto the top step, the rain forming a curtain around them, enclosing them in a small, private world. Annabelle looked at her hands. They were blistered and black with soot. A long, red burn marked her forearm where an ember had landed. She began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable tremor from the cold and the shock. Elijah gently took her arm. He went inside and came back with a clean cloth and a jar of salve. His touch was incredibly gentle as he cleaned the burn and spread the soothing ointment over it. "You were brave tonight," he said, his voice a low, rough sound. "We were all brave," she whispered. It was not enough. "No," he said, his eyes on the smoldering ruin of the barn. "It was not." He looked down at his own hands, at the network of old scars that crisscrossed his palms and knuckles. "A man collects scars out here," he said, his voice distant. "Some on the outside." He touched his chest. "Some on the inside. I thought the ones on the inside were the ones that could never heal." He looked at her then, his gaze so direct, so full of a raw, unguarded emotion that it took her breath away. "I was wrong," he said. "You have been healing a part of me I thought was dead. I was so afraid of the pain. I did not realize I was shutting out the joy, too." The rain fell harder, a steady drumming on the roof. Annabelle could feel the warmth of his body next to hers, a solid, living presence in the cold, wet dawn. She saw the exhaustion in his face, but she also saw something new, something that had not been there before the fire. The last of the walls had burned down tonight. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and traced the line of a white scar on the back of his hand. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of a profound and quiet communion. Two scarred people, finding solace in the wreckage. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She met him halfway. His kiss was not the kiss of a desperate, lonely man. It was a kiss of homecoming. It tasted of smoke and rain and a deep, abiding tenderness that seemed to well up from the very center of his soul. It was a promise, made in silence, to face the ruin and rebuild, together. When the kiss ended, they did not move apart. He rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool air. She leaned her head on his shoulder, his arm coming around her to hold her close. They did not need words. They simply sat, two exhausted survivors, drawing strength from each other as the rain washed the world clean. The future was uncertain. Their enemies were real. But on this porch, in this small circle of warmth, They had found their shelter. Later that morning, Deputy Harlan arrived, his face grim. He walked through the sodden, blackened remains of the barn, his boots sinking into the mud. Annabelle and Elijah watched him from the porch. "This was no accident," Harlan said, his voice flat. He pointed to a set of tracks near the back of the barn, partially washed away but still visible. "These boot prints do not belong to you or any of your men. The heel is a specific brand, one I have seen before. There is a man in town, a drifter. He has been spending a lot of money at the saloon. People say he works for Crow." Just then, one of Harlan's deputies came riding hard into the yard. He pulled his horse to a skidding stop. "We got him, Ben," he said, breathing hard. "We caught him trying to ride out of the territory. The drifter, he had this on him." He handed Harlan a folded piece of oilcloth. Harlan opened it. Inside was a crudely drawn map of the Carter Ranch, with the location of the new secondary irrigation ditch clearly marked, and tucked alongside it was a promissory note, a piece of paper detailing a large debt, signed in a familiar, weak hand. It was a note of debt from Levi Ransom to Silas Crow. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. The church at Bitter Creek served a dual purpose. On Sundays, its pews were filled with families seeking salvation. On weekdays, with the Bible put away and the altar covered, it became the town hall, a place for the community to wrestle with the more earthly matters of justice and survival. Today, it was packed. Every rancher, merchant, and homesteader for 50 miles seemed to be there, their faces a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and grim interest. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, damp earth, and brewing conflict. Annabelle sat on the front pew between Elijah and Lily. She had insisted the child come. She wanted Lily to see what it meant to stand for something, to see her father and the woman who was becoming her mother face down a threat not with violence, but with truth. Annabelle held one of Lily's hands, and Elijah's large, warm hand rested on top of hers, a silent, solid anchor. They were a family, presenting a united front to the world. Across the aisle sat Silas Crow and two of his hard-faced foremen. Crow looked entirely unconcerned, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the work clothes of the other men. He surveyed the room with the proprietary air of a man who believed he owned everything and everyone in it. A few rows behind him, between two of Deputy Harlan's men, sat Levi Ransom. He was a husk of a man, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Reverend Calhoun stood at the pulpit, his face stern. For once, his judgment seemed aimed not at personal sin but at a communal wound. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice echoing in the rafters, "to address a matter that strikes at the heart of our community. A dispute over property has escalated to an act of violence. We are here to hear the facts, to weigh the truth, and to decide on a path forward that ensures peace and fairness for all." He called on Elijah first. Elijah stood, his presence filling the space. He did not shout or accuse. He spoke plainly, his voice a low, steady rumble, of the threats made by Crow's man, of the constant surveillance, and of the fire that had nearly cost them everything. "My family has worked that land for 2 generations," he concluded, his eyes fixed on the assembly. "We have never bothered our neighbors. We ask only to be left alone to do the same." He then looked down at Annabelle. "My fiancée, Miss Hawthorne, has been keeping my books. She can speak to the state of the ranch." A murmur went through the crowd. Fiancée. The word was new, a public declaration that solidified what many had only guessed at. Annabelle felt a flush of warmth spread through her chest. She stood, the ledger book in her hands. She was not the abandoned bride now. She was a woman with a stake, a partner in this fight. Her voice was calm and clear as she opened the book. She spoke not of emotion, but of facts. She detailed the number of new calves, the projected yield from the hayfields before the fire, the cost of the new irrigation ditch they had begun to dig. She unrolled the map of the property and explained their plan for water self-sufficiency. Her presentation was professional, undeniable. It was the testimony of a woman who was building a future, not running from a past. When she finished, Deputy Harlan stepped forward. He was all business. He presented the evidence with methodical precision. He showed the plaster cast he had made of the boot print found in the ashes. He described the capture of the drifter, a known hired gun. And then he held up the oilcloth packet. The room went silent. He unrolled the map of the Carter Ranch, the new ditch clearly marked. Then he held up the second document. "This," Harlan said, his voice ringing with authority, "is a promissory note, a debt of $500, owed by Levi Ransom to Silas Crow, and on the back, an addendum, signed by both parties, stating that the debt would be considered paid in full upon delivery of a full accounting of the Carter Ranch's assets and weaknesses." A collective gasp went through the church. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a signed and dated fact. Samuel was called next. The old man walked to the front, his back straight, his eyes clear. He spoke of the early days, of how the Carters and the other original families had always shared resources in hard times. Then he looked directly at Silas Crow. "I have seen your kind before," he said, his voice raspy with age but strong with conviction. "You do not build. You see a neighbor's good fortune not as something to be celebrated, but as something to be coveted. That is not the way of this valley." It was Crow's turn to speak. He rose slowly, a condescending smile on his face. "Reverend neighbors," he began, his voice smooth and oiled. "It seems a simple business dispute has been turned into a melodrama. Yes, I wish to purchase Mr. Carter's water rights. My offer was more than fair. As for this arson, I know nothing of it. This drifter is a liar. And Mr. Ransom," he said, waving a dismissive hand, "is a desperate man who would say anything. This is all hearsay and foolishness." He then played his ace, as many of you know. "I am the primary investor in the proposed railroad spur. It is a venture that will bring prosperity to this entire valley, connecting us to the markets in the east. It is an expensive undertaking, and it requires a stable, friendly community in which to operate. If my good name can be dragged through the mud on such flimsy pretense, perhaps my investment would be better placed elsewhere." The threat landed with the force of a physical blow. The promise of the railroad was the town's great hope. Fear rippled through the pews. Men looked at their neighbors, their faces etched with a new uncertainty. Harlan brought Levi Ransom to the front. Levi could not look at anyone. He stared at his own shuffling feet. "Did you provide Silas Crow with information about the Carter Ranch in exchange for the cancellation of your debt?" Harlan asked, his voice like stone. Levi mumbled something. "Speak up," Harlan commanded. "Yes," Levi whispered. The word of poison in the air. He said he only wanted to make a fair offer. He said no one would get hurt. Elijah rose from his seat, a low growl of pure fury in his throat. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the raw, primal instinct to protect his own, to physically crush the men who had threatened his family and betrayed the woman he loved, was overwhelming. Annabelle stood with him, but she did not pull him back. She simply laid her hand on his fist. She did not need to speak. Her touch was a communication of its own. It said, "We are stronger than this. We win with the truth, not with our hands." Elijah looked down at her calm, resolute face. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the tension went out of his shoulders. He slowly, deliberately, unclenched his hand and took hers. It was in that moment of heavy, uncertain silence that Ruthie stood up. Her face was flushed, her usual good humor replaced by a righteous anger. "Silas Crow talks about fair offers?" she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "Let me tell you about his fair offers. When my husband passed, and I was alone with a mortgage and 2 small children, His foreman came to me. He offered me 10 cents on the dollar for my land. He told me it was a woman's lot to fail. He told me the bank would take it anyway, and I would be left with nothing. He tried to use my grief to steal my children's inheritance. She turned to the pews. Am I the only one, she asked. An older woman stood up. He did the same to me after my George died. A man in the back stood. His men dammed up a feeder creek and tried to dry out my north pasture. Suddenly, the fear was gone, replaced by a wave of shared resentment. The room filled with voices, a chorus of grievances against the man who had sought to bully them all into submission. Reverend Calhoun held up his hands for silence. He conferred for a long moment with Deputy Harlan and a few of the town's founding ranchers. When he turned back to the assembly, his face was set like granite. This body has no legal authority to convict a man of a crime, he announced, but we do have the authority to set the standards of our own community. Therefore, we have decided the following. First, a petition will be sent to the territorial capital, requesting an immediate and official survey of all water rights in this valley. Second, until that survey is complete, Silas Crow and his employees are forbidden from interfering in any way with the creek that runs through the Carter Ranch. Third, he said, his eyes falling on the pathetic figure of Levi Ransom. Levi Ransom will be given 24 hours to settle his affairs. He is no longer welcome in Bitter Creek. As Calhoun finished speaking, the church bell began to toll, its deep, clear notes ringing out over the valley. It was the sound of a community reclaiming itself, a sound of fairness, hard won. Annabelle, Elijah, and Lily walked out of the church and into the bright afternoon sun. They had won. People came up to shake Elijah's hand, to clap him on the shoulder. Ruthie enveloped Annabelle in a fierce hug. For the first time, Annabelle felt not like an outsider, but like she belonged. As they passed Silas Crow on the steps, he turned to them. The mask of civility was gone. His face was a contortion of pure, malevolent hatred. He leaned close to Elijah, his voice a venomous whisper. You think you have won. You put out a small fire with a lot of talk. The next fire will be bigger, and there will be no one left to talk. He smiled, a cold, dead thing, and walked away, leaving the threat to hang in the clean mountain air. The victory at the church was a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that was far from over. In the weeks that followed, a cautious optimism settled over the Carter Ranch, shadowed by the ever-present threat of Silas Crow's final, whispered promise. The community, however, had chosen its side. Neighbors rode over not just with gossip, but with offers of lumber and labor. A barn raising was planned, a communal act of defiance and solidarity that was the very bedrock of life in the territory. They worked under a sky of hammered brass. The spring rains had given way to a hot, dry summer that baked the moisture from the earth and cured the tall prairie grass to a crisp, golden tinder. Every day the sun beat down, relentless and white-hot. The air grew thin and electric, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with Silas Crow. The old-timers like Samuel would look to the west, sniff the air, and shake their heads. It was fire weather. The work on the secondary irrigation ditch continued, a race against the coming drought and Crow's deadline. It was back-breaking labor, carving a channel through the tough prairie sod with plows and spades. Annabelle worked alongside the men, her hands blistered, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, her presence a quiet inspiration. She was no longer a guest or even a fiancée in name only. She was the ranch's co-commander, her strategic mind as vital to their survival as Elijah's strength. The storm came on an afternoon when the sky had turned a bruised, greenish-purple, and the air was so still and heavy it felt hard to breathe. There was no rain, just a furious, dry wind that whipped the grass into a frenzy, and then the lightning. It was not a normal storm, but a barrage, a series of jagged, violet slashes that tore the sky apart, each one followed by a deafening crack of thunder. They saw the smoke first, a thin column rising from the north pasture. where the lightning had struck a lone cottonwood tree, then fanned by the ferocious wind. The smoke thickened and blackened, and a low orange glow appeared at its base, a prairie fire. "Samuel, get the women and Lily to the creek bed," Elijah yelled, his voice barely audible over the wind's howl. "Everyone else, grab wet sacks, shovels, anything you have. We have to try and build a break." But it was already too late for that. The fire was moving with terrifying speed, a roaring, devouring beast that consumed the dry grass, its front a wall of flame 30 feet high. The wind was at its back, driving it directly toward the heart of the ranch. Then, through the swirling smoke, Annabelle saw something that made her blood run cold. Riders, 3 of them, on the far side of the north pasture. They were not fighting the fire. They were working frantically along the fence line, cutting the wires, and behind them, another of Crow's men was firing a pistol, hazing the terrified herd of cattle, turning them, driving them directly into the path of the oncoming inferno. It was an act of pure, calculated evil. Crow was not just trying to destroy their grazing land, he was trying to wipe out their entire herd, the sum of their wealth and their future, using the fire as his weapon. "Elijah! The cattle!" she screamed, pointing. Elijah's face became a mask of cold, hard fury. He understood instantly. He turned to his men. "Forget the fire break. We have to turn the herd. We have to save what we can." He spurred his horse toward the panicked animals, a desperate, impossible charge into a vision of hell. Annabelle watched him go, a feeling of utter helplessness washing over her. They could not outrun the fire. They could not turn back 1,000 panicked animals. They were going to lose everything. Her mind raced, sifting through the maps she had studied, the plans she had made. The ditch, their new irrigation ditch, ran perpendicular to the fire's path. It was not deep, not wide, but it was a scar on the land, a break. "Samuel," she yelled, running to the old man as he was leading Lily toward the safety of the creek. "The new ditch. We have to flood it now." Samuel's eyes widened as he understood. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. He sent one of the younger hands to help her. They raced to the head of the new ditch, where they had constructed a makeshift dam to control the flow from the upper spring. They worked with frantic energy, tearing at the rocks and packed earth, the roar of the approaching fire a constant, terrifying thunder. Just as the first of the panicked cattle reached the ditch, a figure on a lathered, exhausted horse appeared out of the smoke. It was Levi Ransom. He was supposed to be long gone, on his way out of the territory. His face was streaked with soot and tears. "I saw the smoke," he gasped, his voice raw. Crow's men! They were not just cutting fences. They painted the posts with pine tar, on the far side of the pasture, by the rock outcropping, to make sure the fire jumped the trail. "It is a trap." He pointed a trembling finger into the smoke. "They are waiting there, to make sure the job is finished." He looked at Annabelle, his eyes filled with a desperate, final plea for redemption. "I am so sorry, Annabelle, for everything." There was no time for forgiveness or condemnation. Annabelle only nodded, her mind already processing the new information. They finally broke through the dam. A torrent of muddy water, the ranch's lifeblood, surged into the new channel, turning the shallow ditch into a muddy, impassable barrier just as the fire front reached its edge. The flames hit the wet earth and the standing water with a furious hiss, throwing up a massive wall of steam and smoke. But they did not cross. The ditch was holding. Through the thick, acrid smoke, they could see the dark shapes of Crow's men on the other side, momentarily thwarted. Elijah and his hands had managed to turn the bulk of the herd, pushing them south along the new fire break. The ranch was not saved, but Annabelle's quick thinking and Levi's last-minute confession had given them a fighting chance. Just then, Deputy Harlan and a posse of armed townsmen came riding hard into the valley, drawn by the smoke that was visible for miles. Elijah rode to meet him, his face black with soot. "Crow's men are on the other side of that ditch." "Ben," he said, pointing. They are the ones who started this. We will handle them, Harlan said grimly. You save your ranch. The fire was still raging to the east and west, a horseshoe of destruction closing in on them. It was Samuel who made the call. We have to backburn, he yelled, his voice carrying over the roar. It is our only chance. We have to fight fire with fire. It was the most dangerous maneuver in firefighting, a controlled burn that would starve the main fire of its fuel. With the help of the townsmen, they began to set their own line of fire, a carefully managed blaze that crept slowly toward the raging inferno. For hours, they worked in the suffocating heat and smoke, a small army of men and women fighting for their lives and their homes. In the midst of the chaos, Elijah and Harlan crossed the ditch and rode into the smoke. They found Silas Crow on a rise, watching the destruction with a look of smug satisfaction. His hired guns were with him. When he saw them, he reached for his pistol, but he was too late. Harlan's men had them surrounded. There was no shootout, no final blaze of glory, just the quiet, ignominious click of handcuffs on a rich man's wrists. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the two fires met, with nothing left to consume. The inferno died with a final, gusty sigh, leaving behind a world of black, smoking ruin. The fire was out. The sun rose on a landscape of devastation. The prairie was a blackened, barren desert, but the ranch house, the new barn, and the stables were still standing. The herd, though smaller, was safe. They had survived. Crow and his men were led away in disgrace. Levi Ransom, given a chance to speak to the territorial judge, did not ask for mercy. He accepted his fate, a sentence of 5 years of hard labor on the Southern Railroad line, a chance to pay his debt, not with money, but with sweat and time. The rains came a few weeks later, a gentle, healing baptism that washed the soot from the air and soaked into the scorched earth. And then, a miracle. Tiny, vibrant green shoots began to push their way up through the blackened soil. The prairie was being reborn. Their wedding was not in the church. It was held on the front porch of the cabin, the same porch where they had found each other after the first fire. The whole valley was there. Annabelle wore a simple dress of blue calico, the same color as the Montana sky. She did not need ivory or lace. She was not a bride from a mail-order catalog. She was the woman of this ranch, her hands linked with the man she loved, her feet planted firmly on the ground she had helped to save. Lily, her face beaming, stood before them, holding a ring of wildflowers. As Annabelle took Elijah's hand, Lily looked up at her, her dark eyes filled with a solemn, profound happiness. And then she spoke the words that had started it all, not as a child's confused observation, but as the highest blessing she could bestow. "Daddy," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "She looks like Mommy." A tremor went through Elijah. He looked at Annabelle, at her strong, beautiful face, and the last of the ghosts fled his heart. Sarah was not being replaced. She was being honored. His family was not broken, not patched together. It was whole. He smiled, a true, unburdened smile, and leaned down to kiss his bride, his partner, his improbable, miraculous love. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.